humanitarian crisis of the past year has been the European refugee crisis, with many helpless men, women, and children risking their lives to travel thousands of miles to escape certain death. While many European countries have reached out to them with open arms, there are simply more refugees that the government could take. It's time that we turn to the arms of our EU citizens and ask them to do their share for the sake of humanity. As the European Union side government in today's debate is happy to propose financially incentivizing EU citizens to personally house Syrian refugees. So our policy: first, we will estimate the cost of taking care of one adult in the average household in every EU nation and offer a monthly payout to every household for every refugee that they take in. And second, every household will be responsible in ensuring that the minimum standard of living is provided and no forms of abuse will be levied against these refugees. We will mandate a monthly check-in with the closest refugee centers to affirm that. Legal recourses and investigations will be available for any suspicion of abuse. So I will present two arguments. First, that EU nations have the limited capacity to house Syrian refugees without the help of EU citizens. And second, why this significantly assists the ability of refugees to integrate into a foreign community. So first, that EU nations have a limited capacity to house Syrian refugees without the help of EU citizens. The reality of refugee inflow is that there are no existing facilities built to deal with the unprecedented high arrival of refugees in the last year. In Germany alone, which has had only 300,000 asylum applications in its history, has had to accept over 570,000 unregistered refugees in the span of 1 month. The reality of the refugee camps have grown to be gruesome due to it being overcrowded with limited resources. The most that these governments can do is to put them underneath roofs to prevent them from being exposed to the harshness of winter. Even then, these refugee tents are far from being winterproof. They are lacking basic necessities like sufficient clothing and food to scrap by the minimum standard of living. Researchers are stretched out to the furthest, but the biggest hurdle for these EU nations is time. It takes a tremendous amount of time to convert resources into working facilities, but we have lost any potential waiting period. For that reason, governments are encouraging citizens to donate in kind but not in cash, as it saves valuable time to give amenities directly to refugees rather than to purchase them with large bulk. The singular downfall of this measure is that citizens are unable to donate living spaces, which is the most scarce resource when it comes to accessing refugees. With this policy of offering citizens to house these refugees directly, we are able to address that particular scarcity and time deficiency. Additionally, this is the far most cost-effective solution to accepting as many refugees as possible. The problem with the government spending on infrastructure on permanent refugee camps is that these facilities will not be utilized permanently or optimally. There will be time periods where the refugee influx is no longer a pressing concern and refugees will be continually integrated back with the larger society. There is also no financial return to this particular investment. Thus, it is a very financially inefficient expenditure. In contrast, there is existing space within many residential areas which are already paid for but are not being used optimally. This allows the government to make one all-encompassing payment for each refugee rather than spend more resources to the many costs involved in operating large refugee camps. The reliance on EU citizens is not just on an economic basis but also on a morality basis. The European Union has been known to be the most progressive economic bloc of nations with the highest collective standards of human rights. As EU citizens, they are also bound by those same humanitarian standards. Unfortunately, the ability of governments to grant rights is directly linked to how much resources they possess. Giving people the right to food, water, and shelter costs money. In instances where the government is unable to empower rights, society must ask as a safety net to facilitate those rights. In the same way that social organizations are built to help the poor gain access to basic rights, when government welfare and programs are insufficient, we need to encourage EU citizens to do their role in upholding the standard of rights that we believe all humans should have access to. Secondly, why this significantly assists the ability of refugees to integrate into a foreign community. The bigger picture for refugee acceptance is to constructively integrate them into a larger society. If the structure of refugee camps are designed to minimize the possibility of a healthy introduction into the foreign country that they're in. So it is likely that these refugees have gone through many traumatic experiences such as the civil war back at home and life-threatening journeys to Europe. What they need to be exposed to is a sense of normalcy and stability, as well as gestures of kindness and acceptance. The type of exposure that they will have instead is a sense of hecticness, instability, as well as hostility. Refugee camps will be overcrowded, and the staff members are likely to be overworked and understaffed, and the kind of responses they will get to requests or inquiries will be overwhelmingly one of uncertainty or rejection. This will further perpetuate the kind of instability that refugees are running away from and increase the struggles of effective migration. In contrast, if they're relocated to average humanitarian homes within an EU nation, they're more likely to experience the peace and stability of a home. This will also allow them to slowly come to terms with the new experiences they face in that country. This will also be West culture shock once they have been released from their refugee status and asked to integrate with society. As it stands right now, when a refugee has his or her application approved, he is asked to leave the refugee accommodation and find a job within the first month of his application, or his application will be rescinded. The refugee has not had the opportunity to learn the language or interact with the locals or experience how this new society functions. They're often culture shocked and unable to integrate effectively from that period forward, especially when you think of like the Oktoberfest in Germany and thinking of these people as being Muslim people. Additionally, any migrant moving into a new country will struggle with acceptance into community, and this will undermine their sense of self-worth. By being home with a local, you will be able to encourage them into activities with local communities as well. It can be as simple as chatting with a neighbor, attending local council meetings, or volunteering at the nearest shelters or soup kitchens. The ability to live normally in that community, as well as the ability to make contribution positively, will give them a sense of belonging, and correspondingly, they'll want to make more efforts toward integration. Ultimately, the degree of integration will be premised on the amount of effort each refugee puts in. Those who put in more effort to learn the language, interact more often, and volunteer in the community are more likely to experience success in organic integration. And the first step towards that integration is homing them within the local community and not away from them. So, Mr. and Madam Speaker, this debate is about the best method in which we can assist these refugees. In the status quo, we are helping them already, but we need something more effective. The answer is this policy. We will be able to increase the minimum standard of living for these refugees, and we will be able to integrate more effectively by asking EU citizens to do their share in the empowerment of human rights. Thank you.
Right, we thank the Prime Minister. Would like to recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
In today's debate, proposition solution is not a practical solution to whatever problem that they're talking about, right? Our stance in today's debate is simple. The trend, even now, without their monetary factor, we see that people are already accepting refugees. And this trend is increasing to the fact that we don't need their policy. We find no necessity of their policy, and we find that the trend is already in so that this problem is not as exaggerated as they make it seem, which is why upon this motion, opposition is proud to oppose. So before we move on to our substantive speech, I'd like to present the rebuttals I have towards the previous speaker. So she talked about how right now there are no existing facilities, right? But we say that there's no point of the proposition policy as citizens are already accepting refugees, and this is an increasing trend. We recognize that the problem exists, and we recognize that this is a dire problem, and that people need to be housed, but why would you stop the altruistic factor and the altruistic trend of housing people? Because we find that already there are many citizens that are willing to, without the monetary factor, without the money that is given, there are many citizens that are willing to house these refugees, and that there is absolutely no need or necessity of their policy. Also, she talked about the moral basis and how she's standing for morality on proposition. Now, we find this a contradiction because we find that, in fact, they're standing for the complete opposite, because we see that their case is exactly going against morality. They're treating refugees as commodities and shaping them as a burden. That's why you need the money. That's why you need to provide them the money so that citizens will accept them into their houses. And we see that the current trend, because people are already doing this without the monetary factor, in fact, putting an economic factor and providing them with the money or subsidizing them, that actually worsen the problem, which I'm going to explain further on in my speech. So in today's debate, our stance is simple. If your problem is that private actors or NGOs organizing a distribution of homes to refugees is not dependable or accountable enough, we say that sure, states can act as a middleman in matching and regulating refugees with the people who are willing to host them. We think that this is pretty much in line with what is already happening in the status quo, and we're willing to support that. What we're not okay with, however, is the paying of people for their altruism. We think that status quo demonstrates that even without the money and even without the motivation of the money, that this isn't, even without this policy, thousands of people all over Europe are already willing to help this crisis. And we think that rather proposition's model will worsen this problem, which is why we're going to present our four arguments. So first, I'm going to talk about why this will discourage actions of altruism even more. Second, we're going to talk about how this will fundamentally alter the relations between the refugees and the hosts. And our second speaker will talk about how this will give room for EU nation states to shift their burden on other nations, and lastly, about this will lead to a grossly poor prioritization of budget and welfare for refugees. So directly moving on to my first argument. Why will the premise of this policy and the policy's depiction of refugees only discourage altruism and the current trend, which we find beneficial? Because the reason we are seeing altruistic offers to house refugees all over Europe has nothing to do with money, right? The following is what one user posted on Airbnb for refugees, one of the many websites matching refugees for homes. She quoted, "Often I find it difficult to make ends meet and need assistance from social services, but despite having little, I'm all ready to help. I'm willing to give clothing, food, toys, household appliances, and the use of my home." This user is only one of the hundreds of thousands of people who are actively reaching out to help refugees all over Europe. People, even the ones who cannot most economically well support these refugees, are willing to chip in to help based on what they can afford because they have empathy and humanize with refugees. People are doing this because they think it's the right thing to do, and we applaud this nobility. Why are we attaching a monetary compensation rather than curb the sentiment of altruism? Because more often than not, we say that marketization of altruism or virtues results in corruption of original goodwill. Even if proposition side insists to you that under their model, some people will still offer homes without being paid, we don't really think that anyone will have the reason to decline money. And besides, we think that's not the main point. The main point is when some people start receiving money, the original identity that housing a refugee will fade away, and the action becomes one tainted and motivated purely by money and economic incentives, not because of the true will to help out these refugees. And thus the proposition today cannot deny that if they're trying to stay, more people will opt into housing refugees once they receive money. People will feel a more diminished experience when their goodwill is degraded or demeaned according to a lower motive value than what should be really appreciated. And in other words, we say that when their actions are no longer perceived as purely altruistic, and also the act of housing refugees will start being viewed as a burdensome and negative thing, and also negative thing that should be compensated for, we think that that's not the trend that we want to see in our society, and status quo is fine. Now this brings me to my second argument of how will the dynamics of refugee-host relations be worsened? Because in status quo, people act purely out of goodwill. The dynamics of relations between refugees and hosts are like the relationships of a guest and host. The host tries to make the guest feel at home and renders assistance in any way possible. If people are paid, however, they become landlord and tenant. Now the refugees are there because if they're paid to be there, then the landlords develop an entitlement to the money because they're simply being paid to do this. They're no longer welcome just because, but rather because a fee is paid and because they feel an obligation to make the refugee and house the refugee and because of the monetary factor. And we think that this is the exclusive harm that occurs under proposition's model, while the benefits that we talked about without the monetary factor are completely non-mutually exclusive and can be achieved even better on our side. And for all these reasons, opposition is very proud to oppose.
Right, being previous, we now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
So Mr. and Madam Speaker, we find it very problematic from the opposition team that's telling us that we're going to degrade altruism by trying to help them by financially incentivizing these people. We want to make it clear on team government, but that we're not actually giving them money for the sake of their compensation of actually hosting another man in their house. We're compensating them so that they can pay for the living cost of another mouth in their homes. We're not compensating for their altruism. We're helping them do more altruism so that they can pay for the living cost of these people. I'm going to characterize how we have much more benefits by actually doing this financially incentivization of these people because of the certain characteristics that people have, where if they're given the money, they're kind enough that they don't have the money, and this policy is targeting those people who have goodwill but simply lack the money to feed another mouth in their homes, and that's the people we're targeting. It should not be simply saying that we're compensating for altruism, because that's not what we're doing. We're paying for the living cost of these future refugees in their homes. Now I'm going to move on to rebuttals. They told us it's already a trend and like the people are already accepting these refugees. We said that's only a small portion of people that are both kind and rich. These people can of course accept more refugees in their homes, as the Twitter example gave us. We actually agreed to that point. We said those people are very good, but we see the problem that type 2 people who are very kind, people who want to help but just can't afford the living cost of another refugee. These are the people that we want to target in our society, target in our policy. We said by actually doing this, we can we can increase the amount of people that we can actually house in these homes. Yes.
When you make people buy out these refugees, it disincentivizes them to house refugees because their moral goodwill is cut down by them thinking that they're being paid to do services.
You don't understand why people are thinking that their altruism is being diminished when we're only paying for the living cost of these refugees. We clearly told you that we're not compensating for the altruism. We should not be confusing compensating for altruism and helping that altruism by actually paying for the living cost of another amount. We said that's the differentiation that they failed to make in today's debate. We said they should not be arguing that these people are going to feel sad because now the government is paying them. We're clearly only paying for the living cost of these refugees to begin with. We say that we're actually, because we're paying for the living cost of the refugees, we said there's no reason for these people to feel diminished about their altruism and etc. And we also see, for example, in the action of blood donation, we said that you pay so that you actually give them actually snacks and more money after you actually do blood donation because because of your health risk and because after you do blood donation you need to be actually healthy and you have to eat more energy and etc. That's not paying for your altruism. That's helping you become healthy again after blood donation. We think that's the same thing because people are afraid to do blood donation because they might because they might faint after donating blood so much. We actually give them energy snacks and etc. That's the same thing. We're not paying because they did blood donation. We're paying because they might become unhealthy after blood donation. It's the same thing because they might become poor because of this. They're goodwill and helping the refugees. We're actually helping them pay for the living cost of these refugees. And therefore we said it's very beneficial on our side because we have to tackle also the people who have goodwill but are not rich enough to tackle every single refugee, the status quo. The biggest problem in our society is the living space and the so many amount of refugees in our society. We're 570,000 refugees that we're not able to house. We can't actually only find goodwill and rich people to house all these refugees. We said that we need to also tackle the type 2 people, and that's what we're doing on government side. Moving on to the argument, I'm going to explain to you how this is going to be very beneficial by actually providing the financial refugees. For example, we said our payment is going to actually incentivize the urgent intake of refugees. I'm going to provide you 3 reasons why. First of all, we said these people have underutilized homes to begin with, and we say that their space is being underutilized, but there are not many ways to optimize this actually underutilized space. So, for example, it's the same as you have lots of savings, but you don't know where to invest your money on. We say it's the same thing, but if you give financial incentives, these people are going to be very willing to provide their underutilized space to actually make more financial gains out of this, and actually also help the refugees that they wanted to help in the past, but they failed to do so because of their lack of money. And furthermore, we said that offer of payment also creates more news and actually gain awareness among society. Previously, private citizens had no ability to actually personally assist the refugee in making them feel at home, and the most they could do was volunteer at the refugee camps. But now with this opportunity, people who are humanitarian are going to be much more voluntary and actually help these people by catching this opportunity of also getting the living cost donated by the government as well. And therefore, we said it's going to be much of a larger population that's going to be willing to take these refugees into their homes. And finally, we said it's also going to empower the business-minded to create even more efficient and huge business models to actually house these refugees. We say that just like foster homes in the status quo, the foster homes immensely help the government take care of these orphanages, orphan people who nobody wanted to take in because of this business model. We saw that it was very effective in actually taking care of the orphan problem because now these foster home people actually also want the business incentive while also helping these orphan people. We said that because the business-minded people are even going to make the solution even more effective. We said it's very positive because the business-minded people are going to establish a concept of actually foster homes and etc. And therefore we say the same thing is going to happen in our society. Yes.
If, let's say Turkey wants to house a few refugees, will the EU be paid for them?
We say that if the Turkey citizens want to house the refugees, EU will be paying for them to financially actually aid them in the living cost of the refugees. We don't understand the point of the question. The EU is paying these European countries to actually house and actually add to the living cost of these refugees, and therefore it's very effective in actually solving the refugee crisis in the status quo. We say that there's no problem in the EU paying them or actually having a European nation, the whole financial budget of a European nation, actually investing in the living cost of these refugees and actually increasing the amount of refugees that these people can take taken to their homes, and therefore we say that we don't understand the point of the POI. Of course, the EU is going to pay for the living cost. Furthermore, because as I've clearly told you, the reasons why payment is going to be a very big incentive for these people to be able to take in more refugees, actually, and use the goodwill to actually pay for these refugees. We say that the opposition team can do nothing but only ask for help for goodwill and rich people, which are very uncommon in our society, and that's the problem we're facing. We are going to solve that by also incentivizing the goodwill, but not rich enough people to actually also help these refugees, and therefore we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Right, thank the previous. Now invite the deputy leader of the opposition.
Our case is pretty simple, but government today doesn't get it. Let's talk about an example. You're at a blood donation place, and they say, won't you donate blood? And you think, well, yeah, because me, if I donate blood, it doesn't really harm me, but I'm helping people. So you're morally incentivized to donate your blood. Then someone comes in and says, well, I give you 10,000, so can you please donate blood? This clearly diminishes your moral incentive of donating blood, because now it seems as if, I don't care what government intends to do so, but what happens, what the truth is, your moral incentive is diminished. Now, what seems to be your incentive is to get that mammon. That's why people are clearly not incentivized to house Syrian refugees, because even though their altruism is what's driving them to house these people, it looks as if they're trying to get paid for this. That's why their moral incentive is clearly diminished. Therefore, there will be less people housing their refugees, and therefore there will be more refugees that are going to die. So, we're going to do a few things. We're going to rebut their whole case because their whole case supports nothing. But second of all, move on to our arguments on why the EU would be able to shift burdens on other nations, therefore making people become commodities that are sold off and to be ruined, and therefore it's clearly morally repulsive. And second of all, how there's a clear limited budget and we're allocating it in a very wrong way. So let's talk about rebutting their cases. First of all, both teams clearly agree on the fact that we need to help refugees and protect their rights. But the difference is, we want citizens to help them altruistically or after being paid. Then their side clearly has lack of the moral incentive you have, therefore they have clear less refugees being saved. The difference is clearly that. Therefore we have more people being saved, therefore we're going to win the debate. Let's talk about their arguments and case. I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to rebut their arguments, then I'm going to move on to rebutting their whole case. So their arguments were, all three arguments were about why we should have citizens house incentives, or to be incentives to house citizens, house refugees, because we have a limited capacity to house by ourselves. That clearly is proving nothing. We also agree that citizens have to house citizens. It's just the way how proposition is clearly going the other side of having people house citizens, house refugees, because the reason that they're housing refugees are from the moral incentive, and they clearly get rid of that moral incentive. But let's talk about their case. Their case says there will be more citizens to house refugees simply because we're paying them, and they're going to be able to pay. They're going to be able to pay for the money they need to save the refugees. But clearly not. They talk about case one people and case two people, rich people and poor people. But both of them are less incentivized to pay for whatever they need to save these refugees, because the second you're paid, it means that your moral incentive sticks up and says, well, this looks like I'm not doing it for my moral good, but rather it's like I'm doing it because I want to be paid. And therefore, there is a clear less amount of people that in the moment that want to help these Syrian refugees, and therefore we clearly see how government's world has more dying refugees, yes.
How do you expect to find 500,000 rich and goodwill people?
We don't want to see 500,000 rich and goodwill people. We already see them. We see how Germany's already incentivized to help people. Turkey's already incentivized to help people. We see how the EU already has a welcome refugee program where people are already incentivized to do so. But second of all, we don't necessarily believe that the way of rich people helping isn't the only way. We see, even though I showed you an example of the Airbnb person, there are still people who are not rich enough but still morally incentivized to help people out. And when we follow government's case and diminish the incentive at all, therefore having rich people and poor people not incentivized to help refugees at all, we clearly see a falling number of refugees being saved. So now, let's move on to our arguments. First argument on why EU states are able to shift burdens to other nations, and therefore it's clearly immoral. We think ultimately when the EU is paying people to house refugees, basically people are being compensated to carry out the task of letting refugees in. They clearly said when Turkey is taking in refugees, EU will be paying them. This means that the money the EU pays to people to house these refugees becomes a fee for the EU paying $100 for every single refugee you take in. We think there is absolutely no reason why the same logic can't apply elsewhere. If Turkey or other countries demand money and they say they're going to pay them in exchange for taking some refugees, or if the EU requests other nations to take some refugees and pay them, then refugees basically become burdensome commodities, not human beings that have to be saved. Therefore, themselves and government are making these people not become humans, but rather to become commodities that are sold off. They're as if they are trash pieces that the rich countries bundle up, sell off to poor countries, and to earn more money. And this is simply morally repulsive. The second argument, there's a poor budget allocation happening right now. This debate occurs in a context where resources are incredibly scarce. Under that premise, we think it becomes a clearly important issue that we are able to save even more people than government does. So give a bit more better condition for the refugees, that's also important. When we've already proven to you how monetizing altruism only leads to less altruistic people, we think, in other words, that means a significant portion of the budget we use that can be allocated to bring in more people through other ways of having boats or other ways of having people save them, or welfare, what actually we're doing is to save less refugees to help them, and we believe that's clearly out of alliance from government. Government clearly has the wrong idea because we think that the harm comes from the poor budget allocation we use. We waste money on having less altruistic people saving Syrian refugees, and to rather, in this debate, could mean more than one life could be saved on an opposition case when we have more welfare, more benefits for these refugees, and they can be saved in more ways because people are morally incentivized to help people. So basically, people aren't morally incentivized to help others when they're monetarily given a benefit, because that clearly shows you that you're not going for the moral goal, but you're rather going for the economic goal. Even though that's not what you're intending or what government side is intending, that's what's clearly shown in society, that's what the truth is, and therefore people are clearly less incentivized. When we save more refugees, we're going to win this debate. But when we have less people that are incentivized morally to save refugees, you're going to lose this debate. That's the way the government's running, and that's why they're losing. Thank you.
Right, thanks previous. Now I'd like to invite the government with.
Start. Mr. and Madam Speaker, today we have an opposition that believes government funding itself is an immoral action. The biggest problem coming from the opposition side is that when they actually agree to the problems that exist in the status quo and the problems as where we do not have enough places to put these refugees inside, they should not just maintain that problem and maintain the status quo, maintain those only altruistic grassroots problems that are existing inside society. They need to give us alternatives of how they are going to have more refugees inside their countries. It is not the maintenance of the status quo that solves the problems. We clearly told you how monetary guidance of government is going to incentivize both altruistic people and people that are people that want to help but do not have the monetary resource. We are going to both help these people in order to take care of these refugees, and therefore we believe that the efficiency of our policy and how we solve the problem in the status quo is way much efficient than the opposition model, which does nothing and just watches the situation of problem that exists in the Syrian refugee crisis. So I have two clashes in today's debate. First clash, will this policy decrease the act of altruistic people to participate in refugee housings? Second clash, which side solves the problems that exist in the status quo? To directly go into my first clash. Yes.
Why would people be monetarily altruistic when they're being paid to do things that are moral?
Yes, this is the first clash about those kind of things, so let's move on, guys. So, first of all, they give us a really commonsensically unapprovable argument that morally goodwill is going to decrease the amount of refugees inside the houses. Well, they say that government funding is actually going to decrease, but I'll tell you why it is not going to be decreased. But even if but we believe that even if it is a monetary incentive, still it can benefit if the overall housing itself increases in the first place. To go into the first thing about how it will not decrease people's from actually having these refugees inside. Our second speaker clearly proved to you with two kind of analysis, like seeing two kind of people inside the status quo. First of all, good and rich people, people that have goodwill and are rich. Second type of people are people that have goodwill but does not have those kind of money. We clearly gave you this kind of analysis, but they never reverted to this kind of analysis, and they simply keep on arguing that giving money is not going to increase the amount of refugees. But we clearly tell you, even in blood donation, we can both sell blood, but we can also donate blood. We believe that these kind of both options are existing in the status quo, but still we believe that that doesn't mean there is a decrease of people donating blood in the first place. And that's why we think that what we're trying to say is that these people that are altruistic enough to have these refugees anyway, we're still going to have these refugees because they have that goodwill by our model. But second of all, these people that does not have the capacity to do so are going to be incentivized by our model to solve the problem. And that is why we believe that it's not going to be decreased. But second of all, we believe that this is not a morally decreasing value, because we believe that the money that they are going to get is not going to be used for the greedy need of these people and the host, but these money are going to use to help these Syrian refugees. This is the fundamental reason why we are actually giving money in the first place. And that's why if we are going to utilize that money to suffice the great needs of these Syrian refugees, we believe that there's nothing for us to sacrifice those kind of big beneficial policies in the first place. But lastly, even if you concede to all of those kind of harms and all of those kind of things that this is going to be certainly going to turn up to a monetary incentive, we believe that we still have a better policy, because we clearly prove to you how the overall amount of people that are going to have the refugees are going to drastically increase. So even if we say that it is a monetary incentive, if we solve the problem that is very eminent in the status quo, we better solve the problem and we can better take care of things. Because no, thank you. If you say monetary incentive is bad, then everything is bad. Everybody is working for a job because they want to earn money. But is that bad? That is not bad. Monetary incentive is not bad. But we believe that if the results of that monetary incentive can be good, we believe that that is perfectly justifiable in the society. And that's why we believe that there are unreasonable logic about how monetary incentive is just going to decrease the amount of refugees does not stand in today's debate. To directly go on to my second class, which side solved the problem that exists in the status quo? So they try to evade the debate because they lost the first clash. They talk about Turkeys, right? Because we believe that Turkey is not going to be, because the problem of Turkey itself is not going to be eliminated in their case also, because we believe that if these countries cannot have these kind of refugees, and if these countries lack the resources and places to have these refugees in the first place, we believe that their side also has those kind of matters and burdensome matters to actually have these refugees going to the other side, other countries that does not have enough care that EU countries have. And that's why we believe that the problems that exist within the problems that they try to illustrate about Turkeys and how if we do not have enough refugees, they're going to go to Turkey. Those kind of problems still exist under their policy, and that's why they do not have the kind of justification. But also, by using this Turkey example, we can clearly prove to you why our policy is actually going to solve the problem, right? Because we believe that what the EU is going to do, if the EU actually funds these Turkey to actually have these refugees, Turkey is going to get that money and have more refugees inside these countries. We believe that the same logic applies to these individuals that are living inside these countries. We believe that if they are going to get more money, they are going to have more refugees inside their houses, which leads to a unilateral benefit inside the society. And that's what we're doing is not decreasing the amount of up, down, up movement, but also intimidating, making these kind of citizens to more participate in those grassroots movements. Therefore, we solve the policy better and we give a more efficient solution. Therefore, we are very proud to take this debate.
Right, thank leaders. And I invite the opposition to
entire debate, we see Team Proposition completely misunderstanding what is happening in the reality and therefore pushing a policy that is unnecessary in the status quo. We would like to clarify for this entire debate, taking a step away, saying that actually in the status quo, there has been a social trend in which people in the EU are actually more willing to house more Syrian refugees. We tell you that because this social trend is existing, that this leads to the increase of people taking in more Syrian refugees. And therefore it is unnecessary to have more people be incentivized to house more Syrian refugees. We tell you that is the exact reason why this policy, with so many reverse effects that our previous speakers has told you, is a risky policy that the EU does not need to take at the end of the day. So today in my speech, I'd like to clarify a few things first and ask two questions. First, is the status quo working? And second, how will the policy that Team Proposition is proposing de-incentivize the housing of Syrian refugees? I'd like to first clarify on how... Actually, yes.
Well, even in the status quo, that grassroots movement exists, but still we have a lack of resources in place to put these refugees, and that's why we are giving the monetary incentives.
Right, so now they agree to the fact that there is a social trend. We see this as a huge burden on themselves because now they're pushing the debate towards our field. We tell you that when they do agree to the fact that this social trend is existent, they tell you then they should be incentivized even more so that this social trend is boosted. We tell you that if that is exactly what they're trying to aim for, it is too risky for them to do so because like we told you, it de-incentivizes the people that are already trying to do so. And we tell you that also, when this is already happening, there is no reason why this policy should be boosting more people to do so. We see this as completely unnecessary policy coming from Team Proposition. So that directly links to my first question of, is the status quo working? In Team Opposition, we definitely think so, because like I said before, EU citizens are already housing so many people, and it is continuously increasing the population of EU citizens housing them. But there are 2 points of analysis to it. First, because of this increasing people, there's no reason why to have another policy boosted and perhaps be risky, like I've told you. And second, because it is impossible to allocate every single Syrian refugees to every single EU citizen. Because that is impossible, we would like to tell you that when there is this social trend already happening with EU citizens housing, that this money should rather be spent on something else, such as the refugee camps that Team Proposition brought up to this debate. We tell you that when we do have this money to somehow fund these refugees in a way, we shouldn't use it to boost something that is already happening, but we should use it in some other way in which another facility can be improved as well. That will lead to not only having enough Syrian refugees to be housed in EU citizens, because that is already happening, but secondly, that will lead to the bettering of the facilities that are already existent. We tell you that when they intensify the situations, saying that all these refugee camps are in horrible conditions, that is being overpopulated, we tell you that with this money that Team Proposition seems to have, if they're trying to give it to the Syrian refugees, all this money should rather be used in making these facilities a better place, because that will lead to not only the Syrian refugees being housed by EU citizens, but it will also lead to these refugee camps at the end of the day being better facilities, being less overpopulated, and having better supplies for more Syrian refugees to be more welcomed in the EU. So we tell you that at the end of the day, there is absolutely no reason as to why, if they have the money to boost this policy that they're trying to do, and boost this policy and the motion, but it's rather to be used for other things, such as the refugee camps. So having answered that, I'd like to move on to my second question of how will the policy de-incentivize the housing of Syrian refugees? See from the debate, we see that this is what really boiled down to, and seems to be something that Team Proposition from the very beginning misunderstood very, very much. We like to tell them that, to clarify one thing, that all the arguments that they proposed from the PM speech and the DPM speech was completely irrelevant to the debate that we're currently engaged in right now, because we are absolutely agreeing to the fact that there are limited capacities in the refugee camps, and therefore with the money that we're saying that it should be, if we have this money, to be used in refugee camps to better it. But secondly, on their second argument of this morality thing, we tell you that it is absolutely contradictory to morality itself if you're saying that you're going to get all this money and you're going to pay these citizens and say it's underneath the name of morality. We tell you that with this contradictory stance coming from Team Proposition, we don't know whether you want more benevolent citizens to be housing Syrian refugees, or you want just these people to get money and somehow boost it while we tell you it de-incentivizes it. So I'd like to clarify once more for all of the judges and the audience out there that what actually happens when you
do the blood donation is completely different from what Team Proposition tells you. You never ever, barely ever, see people selling blood while there are blood donors out there. The reason why there are so many blood donors is because that they want to do it out of benevolence. And we tell you that the reason why there are no blood sellers is because there are enough people that are already donating this blood. And so when Team Proposition comes up to the podium and tells you that there are actually blood sellers, we tell you that these blood sellers are not going to be accepted by anyone because there is no need for anyone to sell their blood because there are already enough blood donators. We tell you the exact same logic and parallel is drawn to Syrian refugees and the EU citizens housing them because there are enough people already housing them, and so there's absolutely no reason why there should be more people that are incentivized financially, monetarily, by all this money that the EU is providing for these EU citizens to house Syrian refugees. So with this misconception starting from the very beginning of this debate, we'd like to tell you that the status quo is actually working, that there is a social trend. And with the money that Team Proposition has, we tell you that this social trend should keep on going and should rather be used on improving other facilities for the bettering of the Syrian refugees. Thank you.
Alright, thank you, previous. Now recognize the opposition reply.
Can I begin? Civic duties and virtues are built up and not built down. This means that the more we encourage altruism, the better. That's exactly why monetizing altruism ultimately diminishes the total amount of altruism that exists in a society, and why proposition policy has to fall in this debate. And as the last speaker of the opposition bench, I'm going to prove to you why we take this debate. So, under what policy will people be more incentivized to house refugees, right? That's the question that we're trying to answer. Proposition today comes up with a policy seemingly beneficial to solving the EU refugee crisis, when in fact we see that it goes exactly against what they want to support for, the whole support of morality. Their solution goes against morality as it commodifies refugees and labels them as objects and burdens. Why? Because we're putting a connotation by giving these citizens money and by subsidizing these citizens with money, we're giving a connotation that Syrian refugees are detriment and will necessitate money from the government to their house. And we say that this is no different from trading money with one refugee. And moreover, we say that this attaching a monetary factor will de-incentivize people to house refugees. Why? Because we're replacing intrinsic incentives with the commercial incentive, which will only crowd out the original intrinsic values. When you never see a person selling blood, but you see a person donating blood, that's because the person inherently wants to be benevolent, and that's why the person does it out of their moral goodness. In fact, when you put a monetary value to this diminishes, and ultimately they'll be lessening the altruism in our society. And we say that painting refugees in this stroke of brush will obviously affect the way the majority of European population views refugees in general, and that's the reason why proper assimilation doesn't happen on a long term, unlike what they want you to believe, right? So we say that in fact their policy does the exact opposite of what they want to make happen, which is why their policy isn't effective at all. Moreover, we see that proposition's model today is in fact harmful to the social trend we see in the status quo. They're simply worsening the relations that we already see. You don't see people do things because they want money. You see people doing things out of benevolence, and when you put a monetary factor to it, that intrinsic and inherent reason diminishes. So when a monetary value is attached to something, the incentive doesn't become to solely help the people, but it rather becomes a motivation for more money. And that's why it becomes immoral for them to attach monetary value to people that are actually in need. And moreover, they didn't even touch upon how the dynamics of refugee-host relations will be worsened, right? So because even in the status quo, the state right now is when a citizen accepts a refugee at their home, it's make yourself at home and I'm going to try to help you as much as possible. But rather, under their policy, this becomes an obligation, it becomes a burden, and it becomes a duty. And this host and refugee relationship becomes worsened and harmed, which is a practical harm that we see coming from their policy. At the end of the day, we see that opposition are the ones that has an effective solution to the real problem, when in fact their policy is harming our current social trend and harming the current social policies, which is why we definitely take this debate home. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Previous to close the debate, government replies.
After this finals debate, I would like to ask Mr. Diallo to introduce me to the world that he is living so that I can ride an airplane right after this debate and go to his world where there are 500,000 people who are rich and kind. I want to live there too, but we believe that unfortunately, the place that this motion is taking place, the place that this debate is taking place is not such a wonderful world. So we like the opposition world, and if they're debating under their world, which might be a utopian world, then we believe that, well, they could take the debate. But we believe that if we see in the status quo that there is a problem that is existing, a problem that is not being solved by the current grassroots movement that is happening in the status quo, we see that that is the problem. So now, there was an interesting clash and a quite a shameful clash to be actually in the finals about whether there actually is a problem. We believe that in the status quo, the reason why there is a debate on this topic is because that there are not enough altruistic people who are actually taking in refugees. And we believe that that is the problem. And we believe that there was a quite interesting point that was mentioned by the opposition whip about how they talked about there was a limited capacity. And we believe that that's exactly why she pointed out the point about refugee camps. We believe that their stance on whether the problem exists in the first place. We believe that it was very wishy-washy in the first place, so that's why we believe that, well, they were weird in today's debate. And then about whether who's going to solve the problem better. We believe that we have been telling you about how we're going to tackle these people, targeting these people who are not rich and kind but a bit lacking in monetary stuff. So we believe that we will be giving them more financial incentive. We will be supplying them with the financial incentive that they were lacking in order to help them to solve the problem. And we believe that since we are going to actually incentivize the current grassroots movement that is happening, we believe that we are the ones who are actually going to solve the problem, and their policy is just, well, remaining in the status quo with a huge refugee crisis. And then the second point about this decrease in incentive, about moral incentives and financial incentives. We found it interesting that they were talking about if you have a financial incentive, then no other moral incentives will be made. But we found no logical link from the first speaker to the third speaker how this financial incentive is going to suddenly magically distort this altruistic incentive into something better. For example, if we do blood donation and we get chocolate pies, we think that we don't suddenly become evil people that are urging for chocolate pies. We believe that when we get a movie ticket or chocolate pie, we'll say, oh, kids, and we have that kind of altruistic incentive in the first place. We believe that it is just adding on that altruistic incentive with a financial incentive, and we believe that this is the point that we want to make. And then the point about this financial incentive. Let's say that somehow, through no logic on the opposition team, that this kind of financial incentive is going to actually empower these kind of individuals. We saw that they actually proved no harms of financial incentives in the first place. There were no logical reasoning about why is financial incentive something that is bad. So we believe that, so that's why we believe that our logic stands in today's debate. About if there is a financial incentive that actually has a good outcome, which is actually saving more refugees, how this can be actually solving the problem and which is better. So we believe that actually, in the end of the day, we were the ones who had addressed a problem that was actually existing. Well, then in the first time of the debate, they were actually saying that there's no problem, so there will be 500,000 people who are rich and kind. And we believe that since we were the ones who were able to analyze the incentives that incentivize this grassroots movement in a better way, that will be helping the refugees and also helping these altruistic citizens, we believe that we take the finals home. Thank you.
Everyone, please cross the house, shake hands, and Dr.